Dream Love by Eileen Sheehan. Note: portions of the novel could prove too graphic, violent, or sexually explicit for the sensitive reader. It is intended for mature readers. Chapter 1. Have you ever opened your door to find this absolutely gorgeous, hunky specimen of a man standing on the other side? I've dreamt just that, repeatedly, to the point that I'm frustrated with myself for not having a depth of imagination to move beyond this dream guy, pun intended, and into something more substantial. I mean, all he does is stand there with a sexy smirk on his face. Night after night, I see myself in this cozy little log cabin. There's an enormous fieldstone fireplace dominating the room. The warmth from its roaring fire permeates every crack and crevice of the small, but spacious room. Either there's no electricity, or it's gone out for some reason because I'm sitting curled up in an overstuffed, tweed-covered club chair, reading a book by lantern light. I can't see the title of the book, but, by the look of the cover, I'd guess it's a romance novel. I feel pretty content and peaceful. Then, it happens. There's a loud knock on the door. I quietly put my book down and unfold myself out of the chair to go answer the door. When I open the door, he's standing there just as bold as you please. He's tall, dark, handsome, and super hunky. There's a smirk on his face and firelight in his eyes. Then, I wake up. I shifted uncomfortably in the chair while watching Dr. McKenna write in a notebook. After a long, uncomfortable silence, in which the good doctor never once looked my way, I cleared my throat in an exaggerated manner. "How long have you had this reoccurring dream?" the slender, middle-aged doctor asked with a patient smile. I studied the platinum blonde opposite me for a considerable length of time before answering. Noting, for the first time, how the woman's brown eyes reflected a similar light to the man in my dreams, I wondered if that's where I got the inspiration to add that trait to him. "They started shortly after I started seeing you," I replied. "Why, that was months ago," the doctor said with surprise. "It feels like forever," I moaned. "In the beginning, I found them exciting. Now, I just wish I could move further with them or dream of something else. It's like Groundhog Day nightly." The good doctor surprised me with, "Are you currently dating? Are you insinuating that I'm fantasizing about this hunk because I lack a boyfriend?" I asked, indignantly. "The mind is a complex thing. I'm simply looking for a direction in which to search for the reason behind your dreams," she explained. "I don't understand why you waited so long to mention them." "I was sent here by my company for their mandatory therapy to help deal with work-related issues," I said as I did my best to control my irritation. "It's a routine thing we all have to go through periodically. My dreams don't pertain to work. Being a software designer for a gaming company the size of Playtronics can be stressful," she mused. "Hence the mandatory visits to the shrink every so often," I blurted. "As well as the invasion of your sleep with dreams that could very well be your mind trying to tell you about a new game," she added. "I don't deal with erotic software," I complained. "Does a hunky man equate to erotic?" she asked with raised brow. Feeling embarrassingly self-conscious, I lowered my gaze and shook my head. "I believe there is something far deeper going on than just you dreaming about a man you may or may not desire. I'd like to explore this further." "My sessions are up," I protested. "I'd like to continue them," she added. "Is this a mandatory thing?" I asked while raising my own brow in a manner similar to the way she'd just raised hers. "You know it isn't," she said with exasperation. "I'll think about it," I said as I stood to make my leave. "This may be your last session, but your time isn't up yet," she said, commandingly. "Sit." I looked at my watch and scowled as I plopped my backside back down onto the chair while looking at the clock on the wall. 3 minutes. "Are you serious?" "A lot can be said in 3 minutes," she said, briskly. "Such as?" I asked. She looked at her wristwatch and wrote something in her notebook while speaking without looking up at me. "I'd like you to attend a weekend retreat the week after next." "If I don't?" I asked boldly as I stood back up. Let's not find out, okay, she said gently. After locking eyes with my stubborn therapist, I slumped my shoulders and muttered, email the directions to me. I'll do one better, she said with a broad smile. I'll pick you up and drive you there myself. With a rapid shake of my head, I did my best to verbally dissuade the good doctor from doing me the service of taxiing me to her retreat, but to no avail. By the time I left her office, my heart was heavy with apprehension. I assumed it was because I disliked baring my belly to anyone in the way that she insisted I do with her, but a deep nagging in the pit of my stomach suggested that it just might be something more than that. Fitful nights occupied by the same dream and stressful work deadlines left me feeling incapable of resisting her insistence to attend her weekend retreat. Who knows, a retreat just might be the ticket to cure my insomnia and shattered nerves. As I stepped out of the 4-story brick building that housed the office of Dr. Sally McKenna, MD/psychiatrist, I was greeted by my overly anxious friend, Chris. Damn girl, Chris said as she matched her step with mine while walking as far from that place as possible. What did she do, make you run the gamut? I've been out here for ages. I couldn't get her to relinquish one precious minute of her time, I said. I need a drink. Roger's waiting for us back at the office, Chris said quietly. I need a drink, I said again. She must have picked up on the sense of urgency I felt because she nodded and then stepped onto the curb to hail a cab. Mickey's sound good, she asked. Perfect, I replied. Mickey's Pub was a small Irish bar that was only a 10-minute cab ride from work and fairly centrally located between my home and my circle of friends. We met there so often, it could easily be labeled our hangout. As we entered the dusky interior, my nostrils flared with the familiar scent of booze, polished wood, cleaning solution, and body odor. Gertie Hitchcock, as I live and breathe, came a deep voice from the shadows. After all these years, can my eyes be deceiving me? I turned to look into a pair of deep-set eyes that I never expected to have to look into again. Their rich blue-black hue accentuated the natural evilness that plagued me all through school. The oversized nose on the square face that was scarred by adolescent acne rested at an angle as a result of being broken by the wide board that I'd swung with that very intention when I was in junior high. No one calls me Gertrude anymore, Jackal, I said, emphasizing the immature nickname that I'd given Jack Adams long ago. Who's this, Gertie? Chris asked. Gertie, he said with disdain. He's an old pain in the ass, come back to haunt me, I grumbled as I made my way to the bar. I came to see if you're going to attend the funeral, Jack said as he kept pace at my heels like a mad dog. You weren't at the wake. Does that mean that you won't be at the funeral? My body tensed as I listened to his taunting tone. The last thing I wanted was for evil Jack Adams to know that I had no idea who died that we'd both know. Who died? Chris asked. She was clearly still trying to make sense of what was happening. Why not ask her? Jack snarled. Jim Beam on the rocks, I said to the bartender that I'd never seen before. Make it 4 fingers. With a raise of a brow and a broad smile, the unfamiliar bartender went to work. Gertie? Chris said questioningly. The last thing I needed was to be taunted by my high school nemesis. My nerves were incapable of dealing with the stress. I placed elbows on the bar and buried my face in my hands. Feigning remorse? Jack sneered. Bart, I said as I groaned into my hands. Jack's comment about my feigning remorse over the death of someone we both knew was the only clue I needed to realize the deceased was my ex-fiancé, Bart Matthews. Your ex-fiancé, Bart? Chris gasped. I can't believe you couldn't muster up enough decency to pay your respects, Jack said. Leave us, I snapped as I whirled around to give the full effect of my glower, or I'll rip that ugly nose right off your face instead of simply breaking it. Still a bitch, he said as he crept back into the shadows. Don't forget it, I said threateningly. Who the hell is that, and is Bart really dead? Chris whispered as she took a sip of my whiskey. I motioned for the bartender to prepare the identical drink for my friend, while I proceeded to explain my painful history with both Bart Matthews and Jack Adams. I was never a popular girl while growing up in a small town in upstate New York. My body was too skinny, my hair too curly, my teeth were too crooked, and my brain was too smart. A change in my diet, exercise, a good beautician, and an outrageously expensive orthodontist took care of the cosmetic tragedies. Surrounding myself with geeks who equaled, if not bested me, took care of the braininess. Jack was the school bully who plagued me throughout school simply because he could. Bart was his friend, although, at the time, I couldn't understand why, who took pity on me when I was 15 and stood up to Jack when he took my schoolbooks and tried to toss them down the sewer manhole. Back then, it took very little kindness to win me over. Needless to say, after that one heroic act from Bart, I was head over heels in love. Of course, it wasn't reciprocated. It wasn't until I'd gone through my transformation from ugly duckling to swan and was home during my last year of college for the holidays and bumped into him at a party before Bart paid me much notice. By then, I was no stranger to relationships, but the memories and gratitude of his simple act of kindness lured me in. It got serious fairly quickly. By summer, we were engaged. We moved in with each other after I graduated. That was the beginning of our end. The shine quickly wore off the penny. I soon discovered a side of Bart that he'd kept hidden from me. He wasn't as evil as his best buddy, Jack, but he could still be cruel. He justified his behavior by pointing out that his abusiveness was directed toward animals instead of people. When I told Bart that I couldn't marry such a sadist, he fabricated a story about me preferring girls over men, and he just wasn't into such things. His family and friends, which was most of the town, believed him and cursed me for leading him on. It was a mess. With the town being as small as it was, and with Bart's family having such a strong foothold in said town, I decided to not only move out of the apartment I shared with Bart, but I moved right out of town. The home of a college friend in the Queensboro of New York City was only a train ride away. So, I headed there. I picked up a job in a game store, took an occasional train back to visit my parents on my days off, and saved as much money as I could to help fund a small, cozy apartment to move into. Little by little, I gained my footing in the big city. After what seemed like 1,000 interviews, I landed a job at Playtronics. Eventually, with the help of my skills, work ethics, and credentials, I climbed the corporate ladder until I'd reached the very prestigious and stressful position of software designer. That was 3 years ago. So much of my life changed in those 3 short years that I rarely, if ever, looked back at those pre-Playtronics days. On the rare occasions when the memories surfaced, I quickly kicked them out. That, and the fact that I hadn't been in contact with my parents in a while, was why I had no clue that Bart was killed in an automobile accident a few days earlier. "Correct me if I'm wrong," Chris said after downing her second 4 fingers of Jim Beam, "but doesn't it seem a bit odd to run into this character who lives wherever and came all this way, after a viewing of your dead ex-fiancé's corpse at a funeral home an easy 80 miles away, to Mickey's pub so he can torture you about not attending the funeral?" I was so absorbed in walking down memory lane with Chris that it completely went over my head, but she was right. Being hunted down by evil Jack Adams in an Irish pub in the middle of Queens like this was creepy. "So, you caught me," Jack smirked as he stepped back out of the shadows. By now, I'd had enough to drink that I could officially call myself drunk. I did my best to focus on him, but, in truth, he was little more than a blur. "I don't want to catch you," I slurred. "I just want you to go away. I know you don't believe this, but Bart did love you. I'm sure that he'd want you to attend his funeral," Jack said quietly. "That's all I came to say." As he started to walk away, he stopped and added, "Think long and hard. Once he's buried, you can't take back your actions. Could you really live with yourself knowing that you didn't attend his funeral?" "How did you find me?" I asked. "I'm a bounty hunter," he replied. "Finding people is what I do." "That figures," I giggled as I leaned into Chris and signaled the bartender for 2 more drinks. You might want to think about slowing down, Jack warned. Go away, you evil beast, I hissed. Yeah, go away, Chris chimed. I think that I should stick around to make sure you get home okay, he said firmly. Since when did you become chivalrous? I said with surprise. I've never seen you like this, that's all, Jack replied. You don't know me, evil one, I hissed. Be gone with you. I waved my hand as if to shoo him away. Let me call you a cab, he insisted. Listen, buddy, Chris snarled. Take the hint and get lost. May I be of assistance? Asked a tall, slender man in an Armani suit from the opposite end of the bar. Mind your business, Jack snarled. It's difficult to mind much of anything while these two women are continually asking you to leave them alone, the man replied as he started toward us. Even in my drunken stupor, I couldn't help responding to the electric sensuality that he had about him. A closer look told me that he wasn't as slender as I'd originally thought. In fact, he looked to be well-muscled beneath the expertly tailored virgin wool. His short brown hair was cut in a style that neatly framed strong facial features, possessing a European influence. Brilliant honey-brown eyes were set evenly below perfectly shaped brows. They danced with humor as if he was enjoying my reaction to his hot, sexy self. I heard Chris' sharp intake of breath and knew that I wasn't the only one affected by this man. Even the bartender stood perfectly still. It was only Jack who seemed oblivious to the magnitude of this man's presence. Let me call you a cab, Jack insisted, once again. This time he made the mistake of grabbing my upper arm and trying to pull me away from the bar. I have no idea why you're so determined to suddenly play the chivalrous knight, Jack Adams, but kindly find some other female to play it with. It's too late for me, I said. Now let go of me. The visible vice grip that the dark-haired stranger placed on Jack's wrist weakened him to the point that he could no longer hold on to my arm. It was an intense and sobering moment for Jack and all who witnessed it. She said leave her alone, he said in a calm, steely tone. I suggest that you do so. You look familiar, I managed as I watched Jack slink away. Can I buy you a drink? Another time, perhaps, he said as he motioned to the bartender to clear our glasses away. I wasn't finished, I protested as I grabbed the remains of my drink and tossed it down my throat. I think he's trying to tell us we're drunk, Chris giggled. Are we? I asked with genuine curiosity before the world spun around me and disappeared. Chapter 2. The ringing of the telephone was magnified by the pounding headache that was all-consuming. I stretched my body as best as I could on the sofa that I could only assume belonged to Chris and placed my hands over my forehead. Answer the phone, I groaned as I slowly opened my eyes and tried to bring the world into focus. How much did I drink? I asked no one in particular, while I fought down the vomit that was trying to force its way up my esophagus. Clearly, more than you can handle, said the oh-so-familiar voice of Dr. McKenna. What are you doing here? I groaned. I live here, she said in a flat tone. Perhaps I just heard it as flat because of my all-consuming headache. I tried to sit up, but the pain was so excruciating that I was sure I'd lose the battle with the vomit. I'm sick, I said matter-of-factly. I'm not surprised, she said. I'll get you some Alka-Seltzer. It will help with both your stomach and head. I need something really strong for my head, I urged. I doubt that your stomach would tolerate anything else. Just trust me and drink the Alka-Seltzer for now, she said. She was right. As I slowly sipped on the bubbly medicine, my stomach settled down and my headache reduced to a more tolerable level. Where's Chris? I asked as I slowly looked around the room. Where am I? You're in my apartment, she explained. That's right, you already said that. I think, I mused aloud. I've no clue how I got here. I brought you here. I happened to be passing that quaint little Irish pub that you imbibed in. When I saw them struggling with you and your friend, I offered to help. Neither of you were in any condition to tell me where you lived. So, I brought you home with me, Dr. McKenna said in a low voice. Your friend is on the sofa in my den. You know where I live, I protested as I struggled to sit straight up. I have your address on file in my office. I certainly don't carry it around with me in the event that I might stumble upon your drunken backside on the streets of Queens, she said briskly. I need to go home, I said as I stood on shaky legs. Who is Bart? She asked. He's an old boyfriend, I replied sadly. He's dead. After a moment, I added, we were engaged once. I see, she said, thoughtfully. Is that the reason for your drunken fest? I don't know, I said with frustration. I went there with Chris to have a drink or two to unwind. Out of nowhere, comes this guy from my childhood. He bullied me from the time I entered kindergarten until I graduated. He's a real son of a bitch. For some crazy reason, he decided to look me up to tell me that Bart died. Then, he tried to act chivalrous when he saw I drank too much. It got messy. Why would it get messy? She asked. I didn't want him near me, let alone aiding me, I admitted. Somehow, amidst all of the arguing, remembering past hurts, and frustration over the fact he wouldn't disappear, I drank too much. Which of the men helping you was Jack? She asked. There was more than one? I gasped. There were several men hovered around you when I stopped the cab, she admitted. I didn't like the look of things. That's why I stopped. It was pretty stupid of us to get so smashed. The only male I knew in that bar was the creep from my past, and he can hardly be trusted. I'd never seen the bartender before, if he was one of the men helping, I said. There was a man with a crooked nose and acne-scarred face, a man in an expensive suit, she said as she counted on her fingers, and I believe the other was the bartender. I guess I owe you a huge thank you, I sighed. Attending my retreat will do, she chuckled. What's it for again? I asked. Trust me. It's important for you to be there, she assured me. Gertie! Chris shouted with an agonized tone from the other room. Where the hell are we? The apartment was one of 6 that were in a quaint brownstone on the east side of Queens. Although not overly large, it provided plenty of room for a professional who was single and looking for a place to nest and get away from it all. The room I was in was an open living space, where she'd set up the living room and dining area. When I saw Chris come out of what looked to be the second bedroom, it was clear that the doctor had turned it into a small den for when she brought her work home with her. I need to pee, Chris whined as she jiggled in place. It's the door at the end of the hall, Dr. McKenna said, patiently. She looked at me for a moment, before adding, What aren't you telling me? I'm not sure, I replied. It's just that guy in the suit, he looked familiar, but I can't place where I saw him or how I know him. Did he say that you two knew each other? She asked. He never even said his name, I said, thoughtfully. He just came over to help get rid of Jack. It must have been messy to attract a stranger to act as your hero, she said with a grin. My head hurts like a bitch, Chris grumbled as she returned from the bathroom. Oh, hello, she said as she focused on Dr. McKenna. Thanks for putting us up. You remember? I said with surprise. She was less under the weather than you were. Although, she was still dangerously out of it, Dr. McKenna explained. Yeah, Chris admitted. I remember bits and pieces, but not everything. It's like someone slipped something in our drinks or something. Do you think? I said eagerly. Not that I'd want that to happen, but it makes more sense than us drinking ourselves into stupors like that. I'm trying to remember how many drinks we actually had, Chris mused. I can settle this very easily, Dr. McKenna said. I have a friend who works in a lab. We can get her to draw a little blood and test it. I don't know if we need to go to all that trouble, I said, warily. I think that I'd rather just go home, Chris added. Okay, the doctor said as she threw her hands in the air with exasperation. If you feel that you don't need to find out if it's safe to drink there again, then skip the blood test. I bit my lower lip while I debated what to do. I really did just want to go home, but the doctor was right. Neither Chris nor I knew that bartender. What if he was in cohorts with some underground trafficking racket and drugged us? Maybe that handsome guy was there to whisk us off to market and Jack foiled his plans. Maybe he was trying to get rid of Jack for his own personal gain instead of for ours. She's right, I said to Chris. We really should get that blood work done before our systems clear out. I feel so bad, Chris said. Drink some Alka-Seltzer, I offered. It helped calm me down. I turned to the doctor and asked, do you have more? She smiled, nodded, and headed for the kitchen to prepare a glass for Chris. Within a few minutes after drinking it down, not only had the color returned to her cheeks, but she was claiming hunger. I still hadn't reached that point, which was a good thing since the doctor preferred that we wait until after our blood was drawn to eat something. The lab was within walking distance. It gave Chris and me a chance to walk off some of the negative effects from the night before. I smiled to myself as I listened to Chris chatter away with Dr. McKenna about everything and anything. It wasn't until she brought up the topic of Bart and the funeral that I noticeably scowled and asked them to change the subject. Of course, that wasn't about to happen. Not with my therapist in the mix. She poked and prodded until she pulled as much information about Bart and my former relationship with him as she could from me, mindless of the fact that Chris was hanging on to every juicy tidbit divulged. It wasn't that I minded having my best friend listen in. I had nothing to hide on the subject. It's just a personality quirk of mine. I'm not comfortable telling all to anyone. It was decided that, for closure purposes, I would attend the funeral. Chris offered to join me, and I readily agreed. When I called my parents to tell them that I was coming and for what purpose, they made a watered-down attempt to dissuade me. I'm sure that they were battling the mixed emotions of wanting to see me after such a long gap in visits and wanting to protect me from the venomous talk of Bart's family. I told them that I was bringing my best friend from work as a shield and assured them that I'd be fine. By the time our conversation ended, we were all excited about my coming, regardless of the reason. Chapter 3. I won't say that I didn't feel a sense of loss over Bert's death. We were engaged once, after all. Even though it ended badly, I'd had feelings for him at one time. It's just that the thought of sitting within the confines of the church amongst the Gertie haters was more than either I or Chris wanted to endure. We decided to forego the church and catch up with the funeral proceedings at the cemetery. I was surprised to see how intimate a crowd it was that gathered around the open grave. I stood close enough to hear the eulogy, but far enough away as not to intrude on what appeared to be a tight-knit gathering. My ever-supportive friend stayed glued to my side, gripping my elbow at times whenever someone from the group would look our way. I smiled to myself when I remembered the time that Bert accused me of being a lesbian. Chris' intent on shielding me from the mourners could easily be interpreted as the actions of a lover. Just one more thing to fuel their fire. When the service was over, we scurried to leave before the other attendees could get close enough to offer a snide comment or two. "Gertrude, dear, wait up," called Eliza Matthews as she hurried toward us. I looked at the woman dressed in black with curiosity. The last we'd spoken, she'd reiterated the fact that she believed Bart's accusations of my being a lesbian and thought that I was a horrid person for deceiving him in such a way. Hearing her refer to me as dear completely threw me. "Please, dear," she said, breathlessly, as she caught up with us. "Just one moment of your time." "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Matthews," I said, softly. "Thank you," she said as she dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue. "I just wanted to thank you for attending today. I know that it would have meant a lot to my son." I was unsure how to handle this unexpected comment, so I simply mumbled, "Thank you." "I'd like you and your friend to come back to the house for something to eat," she said, hopefully. "Will you do that?" I looked from Chris to Eliza, and then back to Chris again. She shrugged her acceptance of the idea, so I nodded that we'd come. Excellent, she said with satisfaction. Where's your car? I don't own a car, I said flatly. How did you get here? She asked. We walked, Chris offered politely. Across town, she gasped. With a hint of a smile on her face, my friend proceeded to explain that we lived in the very large borough of Queens, where people walked far greater distances than the few miles we'd ventured to attend the funeral. In Queens, walking was cheaper, and often faster, than taking a cab or driving a car. It won't take us long to get to your home, I said firmly. Our legs are strong. Nonsense, she sputtered. You'll ride with me. Charles. Make room in the car for these two young ladies. Without waiting for our reply, she scurried off toward the rather large Lincoln. Quick to comply with her request, her husband, Charles, stood waiting with its back door open. I looked at Chris with raised brow, while she good-naturedly nudged me into motion. It seemed we avoided the confines of the church only to suffer those of the car, followed by the Matthews' modest Cape-style home. I'm so glad you came, Eliza reiterated when we were all settled in the car and headed toward her house. I simply hate the way things ended. She looked at Chris and gave a slight smile. I'm Eliza Matthews. I'm Chris Benning, Chris said sweetly. Gertie and I work together. How nice, Eliza mused. Do you live together too? It was clear that she still believed the accusations about my sexual preferences. I smiled as I watched the myriad of emotions flash over her face when my friend proceeded to tell her that I lived alone and that she lived with her boyfriend who she hoped would soon propose marriage. It wasn't necessary for Chris to divulge so much information to a perfect stranger. I knew that she did this specifically to shatter the rumors about me, and I was grateful. Had I truly been a lesbian or even bisexual, I would have held my head up high and proudly admitted it. It was the fact that I disliked false rumors spread about me, no matter what the topic, that agitated me so. Chris knew and respected this about me, for which I was grateful. Considering the small group at the cemetery, I was surprised to see the number of cars outside of the Matthews residence. It looked like the majority of the funeral attendees did just the opposite from Chris and me. They attended the church and avoided the cemetery. Considering the primitive fear that a good deal of society has where cemeteries are concerned, I understood their reasoning. I may not have agreed with it, but I understood it. The living room and dining room of the 1,400-square-foot house were packed with friends and family. There was a large variety of food laid out on the dining room table, ranging from lasagna and a few casseroles to potato salad and deviled eggs. Considerations were made for vegetarians and carnivores alike. I was incredibly uncomfortable as I inched my way through the sea of strangers. With the exception of Jack Adams, who leaned against the wall in the corner of the room glowering at me along with Charles and Eliza Matthews, and Chris, I didn't know a soul. Who are these people? Chris whispered as she stood next to me filling her plate with potato salad and cold cuts. Your guess is as good as mine, I replied. We're on fairly even ground in this one, and I used to live here. It's weird, she said with a slight shudder. It's a funeral, I reminded her. They're rarely filled with joy and pleasantries. Just the same, let's eat and do the nicey-nicey thing with the Matthews and then get the hell out of here, she urged. You don't have to ask me twice, I sighed. I don't know why I allowed Dr. McKenna to talk me into this to begin with. It seems to have brought some joy to his mother, Chris observed. I lifted my eyes from the impressive array of food to look for Eliza Matthews upon Chris' mention of her and stopped short when my eyes locked with those of one of the handsomest men I'd ever laid eyes on in my entire life. My body tingled, unnaturally, from head to toe from the somehow familiar intense look he gave me. Propriety called for me to look away. After all, this was a funeral, and not a pickup joint, but I couldn't get my eyes to obey. It was as if they had a mind of their own as they shamelessly drank in every delicious inch of his 6-foot-plus frame. I almost dropped my plate when he politely, but boldly, elbowed his way to me. "Hello," he said in a rich baritone voice that matched the rest of him just fine. "I'm Marcus. Mark for short. You're the ex-fiancé, right?" "You're the guy from the bar," Chris gasped. "Touché," he chuckled softly. "What are you doing here?" she asked with an impolite bluntness that surprised me. It was the very same question that occupied my mind, so someone needed to ask it. Since I seemed to be stuck on stupid from the sheer nearness of him, that responsibility fell on Chris. I just wished that she'd been a bit more diplomatic with her tone, since I seriously doubted that he was stalking us. "I'm paying respects to parents who just lost their son," he replied patiently. "How about you?" My face reddened at the mere question. How callous it would sound if I told the truth about how my therapist felt it would be good for me to have closure from such a bad situation by attending the funeral of the person at the root of that situation, and then I decided to stay for a few eats afterward. Just thinking it shamed me. "Are you from here?" Chris demanded. "Chris," I hissed. "I find it odd that he just happened to be at the bar the other night and, now, he's here," she shrugged. "It is a little odd," I muttered. "Actually, it was intentional," Mark offered. "I was there for Jack." "I'm not sure I follow," I said, hesitantly. "In case you haven't noticed, he's a bit off," Mark whispered as he tapped his pointer finger against his temple. "I was warned that he intended to seek you out and harass you, so I followed him." "Who warned you?" Chris asked suspiciously. "Eliza Matthews," he said. "Jack was always a bully, but I never knew him to be crazy," I said, thoughtfully. "You know about the brain tumor he suffered not long ago, right?" Mark asked. At my rapid intake of air, he added. "I guess not." He lowered his head so that he was speaking close to my ear. I could feel the heat of his breath as he said, "They got the tumor out, but he was left a bit touched." I shuddered at the sensation of his hot breath against my flesh. Ripples of sheer delight traveled my body. I closed my eyes to revel in them. It was then that I realized that if I replaced the expertly tailored suit with a denim shirt and jeans, the same tall, dark, hunky stranger who haunted my dreams was the very same tall, dark, hunky stranger whose deep, breathy voice caressed me in a way that could only be described as erotic. The temptation to shout that I knew him from my dreams was great, but the realization of how crazy I'd sound prevented me from acting upon it. I did, however, step back to put some distance between his sexy energy and my overheated body, so that I could better gather my wits about me. If he noticed my sudden retreat, he made no indication of it as Eliza approached and formally introduced him as the owner of lodge and campgrounds a few miles north of town. It was difficult to visualize the man standing before me dressed and looking like a GQ model operating the local campgrounds. I could, however, easily imagine him doing just that when he was dressed in the casual, manly attire he'd sported in my dreams. If I said it didn't bother me that I'd somehow managed to conjure up a real-life person that I'd never laid eyes on before in my entire life to fantasize about in my dreams, I'd be lying. It both troubled and creeped me out. For the first time since I'd started seeing Dr. McKenna, I was actually eager for an appointment. I clearly had some serious, deep-rooted issues. When I was able to get a word in amidst Chris and Eliza Matthews' babbling, I queried the handsome man of my dreams as much as I could about himself. I learned that, although he looked to be in his late 20s, he was actually in his early 40s. He was single and moved east from Montana a few years ago. He bought the lodge and adjoining campgrounds, almost immediately. Upon hearing this, I decided that perhaps I'd seen him in passing during one of my visits to my parents and immediately abandoned the idea for the emergency session I'd planned on booking with Dr. McKenna as soon as I'd returned home. Rather than us enduring a long and drawn-out event, the time passed quickly and pleasurably. We were so entertained by our handsome new friend that, before we knew it, it was early evening and the mourners were filing out of the quaint little cape while giving one final note of sympathy to Eliza and Charles Matthews. Mark wouldn't hear of us calling a cab to return us to my parents' house and, with Eliza's backing, insisted on driving us himself. By now, we'd spent enough time with him, watched his interactions with other guests, and learned sufficient information to feel comfortable accepting his offer. When Chris eagerly slid into the front seat of his SUV, I chuckled and pushed my slender 5'1" frame into the back. I was glad I'd worn slacks instead of a skirt, since getting up into vehicles the height of an SUV or a truck were never a graceful event for my small frame and short legs. As I adjusted myself into the seat, I noticed a slight grin lighting up Mark's handsome features as he monitored my progress through the rearview mirror. "All set?" he asked when I'd completed wrestling with the seatbelt. "You bet," I said with a giggle that I haven't a clue the reason for. The streets of small-town USA were fairly empty as he maneuvered the SUV with the confidence of someone who spent a great deal of time behind the wheel. Within the matter of minutes, we were outside of my home, giving him our thanks and saying our goodbyes. As I opened the door to slide out of the vehicle, he reached over and gently laid his hand on my shoulder. Shards of erotic energy permeated every inch of me. It felt so amazing that I couldn't help sighing with pleasure. "Have lunch with me tomorrow?" he asked. "Both of us?" I asked, softly, as I looked at Chris waiting next to the car. "Just you," he said with a grin. "Sorry," I said with obvious regret, "she's my guest." "It wouldn't be right." "I wasn't thinking," he said, thoughtfully. "My apologies." "Please, will you both be my guests for lunch tomorrow?" He said it loud enough for Chris to hear. The delight in her eager acceptance overpowered the nagging in my gut, and I nodded my agreement. "What time do you want us there?" I asked. "I'll pick you up around noon," he said as he released my arm and turned back to face the wheel. "Sound good?" "We can take a cab or borrow my parents' car," I offered. "That's up to you, but I need to run a few errands in the morning, so I'll be out, anyway," he said nonchalantly. "You're like our own personal driver," Chris giggled. "Yes, ma'am," he said with a smile and a nod. "We'll be ready," I said with a roll of my eyes as I slid out of the door and positioned myself next to Chris. "Until tomorrow, then," he said with a wave as he pulled the SUV away from the curve. Chris slid her hand through the crook of my arm and guided me up the walk to my parents' house. "Wowza, wowza, what a looker," she mused. "You certainly were taken with him," I snickered. "Come on," she grumbled. "Are you going to try to tell me that you didn't think he was the hottest thing you'd set eyes on since?" "I don't know when." "Since the other night at the bar?" I chuckled. "I was too drunk to really appreciate his hotness," she said with a grin. "He's breathtaking, for sure," I agreed. "The question is he a keeper?" Chris added. "What about Tom?" I asked with surprise. "Not for me, silly." "For you. It's time that you got back into the game," she said. "I didn't know that I was out of the game," I pouted. "I've met the guys that you've been dating," Chris pointed out. "There's no comparison. I believe it would be difficult for any man to hold up against that one," I mused. "You like him, don't you?" she asked. It was so obvious that he liked you that even a blind man would notice. "I don't know him," I replied. "You know enough," she said. "For lunch or maybe even dinner, but don't start planning my wedding quite yet, okay?" I said. "Can I plan the engagement party?" she giggled.